To 1940 in the life of Laurence Olivier.
Larry is the most seductive man in the world.
Well, the man is a chameleon. He has great genius.
There are no half measures. They cannot be for him.
I think he has a great spiritual quality.
There's a malice which is very electric and very exciting.
He was a god.
He's been a signpost, as well as the sign itself.
He's not the tallest. He's not the most handsome. He doesn't have the most beautiful voice. But what equipment nature gave him, he can transmute into something electrifying in the theater. He can look like anything he wants to. Any height, any shape. Richard III, Henry V, Romeo, Lear, Othello. He can encompass anything with the power of his own imagination. He makes us believe with him.
I that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph. I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt my head.
He's what I call a universal person. He understands everybody he meets. He may not perhaps like them, but he can get inside them and understand perhaps why they're so nasty.
I did not kill your husband.
Why, then he is alive. He was gentle, mild, and virtuous.
The better for the King of Heaven that hath him, for he was fitter for that place than earth.
Now I'm fit for any place but hell.
Yes, one place else, if you will hear me name it.
Some dungeon.
Your bedchamber.
There is nothing, of course, more erotically evil than that wooing scene. Obviously, Lady Anne repented pretty soon after isn't the point, but that she capitulated immediately, I truly can understand totally. I think the scene is famous, obviously, because it's always been a high point, a horrible expression of Richard III, but I think particularly when played with Olivier, when played by Olivier, because his capacity for erotic darkness and evil is certainly unsurpassed. In our time, I doubt if anyone has been able to imagine evil in the way that he did.
In some mysterious way, Larry somehow obliterates himself and vanishes in the part that he plays. And in that sense, he is like some sort of master conjurer or master of disguise. And I think that sort of hypnotic power of the stage conjurer is one of the reasons why I think he fascinates the English public. They're always eager to see the transformation that he's going to inflict upon himself, the disappearing act and the reappearance act which follows.
I'm Marcus Licinius Crassus. I'm a Jew. I'm Julius Edmond Santorin. I am a poor man of the desert, but I am the Mahdi.
But it's when she's gone and left me that I stop to say goodnight.
I think that Larry was born a great actor, myself. There's something in his makeup which just is actor. He is, above all else, he is an actor. And I think fully comes to life and is fully realized as a human being as when he is acting.
As an ordinary boy, a chorister, he wasn't really very remarkable. He was not a scholar. He was not good at sport. He had a presence, though. He had a presence even as a boy.
His father came to us and said, do you think you'd go and see my boy act in his school play at St. Margaret's, All Saints Margaret Street? And we said, oh, we'd love to see him. He was 9 years old and playing Brutus. But it was a mature performance. It was a real performance of Brutus, as good as anything you could see. We came back and we said to his father, but my dear, you'll never keep that boy off the stage. He's a born actor, and he was.
Every Christmas or near Christmas, we used to do a Shakespearean play. And amongst these was a play called The Taming of the Shrew, in which Larry was cast to play Catherine. He looked lovely. You know, by the time he was dressed, clothed, and had a wig, he looked marvelous. And he, even at that age, had that passion, which comes out in so many of his performances. I mean, he was a girl. He behaved like a girl, a little rumbustious girl. I think from that moment, Larry's life was set. When he left school, he went on to a public school and then on to I think it was the Central School of Acting in London. And then his career began.
Here was this boy, very thin, looked half-starved, always looked cold, never had an overcoat, hair standing up on end, full of life, uncontrollable. He couldn't control his hands or his feet or anything. He sort of galloped about, made friends with everybody straight away. Everybody loved him. He was always being ticked off for waving his arms too much or dramatic gestures or suddenly producing some extraordinary piece of business which nobody had ever thought of. Coupled with that was his love of the ridiculous and the idiotic, and a great desire to be the thing that he was supposed to be playing. Well, then we did The Tempest, and this went on for months. Oh, these Tempest rehearsals. We all crowded in to see what was going on. I can't remember who was in it. I think Peggy was in it. I can't remember. Anyway, came the great day. Enter Caliban. And everybody nearly passed out. He'd covered himself with green slime and stuff from head to foot and put the most awful suppurating carbuncles all over his face. Everybody was completely bowled out by this horrible sight that crept in. He'd done it, whether he'd done it as a joke or whether he'd done it as one of his sort of tremendous entrances, I don't quite know. But this was the kind of thing he did.
He was a student at the Central School and was sent up with Peggy Ashcroft as the two promising young folk to see whether I thought them good enough to get their diplomas, I think they'd be called. And they elected to do the Merchant of Venice speeches. Now, at this time, Dear Larry had hair growing very low on his forehead, very thick eyebrows. I'm not sure that he hadn't put on little false pieces at the side to make him... he adored, he's always loved make-up and make himself look different. So I dare say he had, because all I know was I could hardly see him for the amount of hair which he got on his face. However, the moment he opened his mouth and began the great speech, there was the authentic actor.
He was driven by this extraordinary talent and gift that he had. He was able to transform himself and forget everything else, and all it poured out, it needed training. It was like a racehorse unbroken. He couldn't control it at all. It was within him, his talent. Had to come out in some way or other. And this was obvious to all of us, stupid girls though we were, aged about 19, 20, that sort of age. It was obvious to us, and we all knew that he would go straight to the top. It's no surprise to us at all.
The Birmingham rep is an incredible repertory because it's not a weekly rep. It's a 2 weekly rep. And I think what gives you such wonderful training is you're doing one play at night, then you're rehearsing the next week's play in the morning, and you're breaking in the following 2 week, in other words, a month ahead. So you carry 3 plays in your head, right? Very good training. And I went to the Birmingham rep. And one of the reasons was that Larry had been there, and Larry was my god, you know.
When Olivier went there, he was only 19. He played parts like Uncle Vanya, but he also had a number of small parts as well. In smaller parts, I think his sense of mischief would come out, as it did when he was playing in a one-act play by Eden Philpotts. He was supposed to be a young man about town, and he was asked by one of the characters, "Who are you?" His reply should have been, "We are conservatives." And instead he said boldly, "We are Freemasons, froth-blowers and gugnungs." I think it's that sense of mischief that has followed him throughout his career.
The first time I was aware of Larry as an actor, I think, was when he made this great success in 2 performances of Journey's End in the early 1920s. This was the great success war play, which was a huge hit both in London and New York. But he only played it for 2 special performances for the Stage Society in the leading part of stand-up, in which he was wonderful. But he was under contract to Basil Dean, who shortly afterwards put him on in Beau Geste, The Circle of Chalk, and he got magnificent notices and became a leading man immediately, which he really hadn't quite been before.
I'd done quite some juvenile leading roles, I suppose you'd call them, from about 1928 to 1930, that sort of thing. And then I joined up with Noel in Private Lives and played that terrible part, Victor Prynne, which I must say he's had the decency to apologize about. And it was very exciting to be in a hit for the first time, and with 2 such glamour figures as Gertie, Lawrence, and Noel. You can imagine how glorious it was.
Gertie was wonderful, and Noel was excellent, and then there was a young actor, dark, very good-looking, and I thought very, very good. And I went backstage after the show, and Noel said, well, what did you think? Well, I said, well, I had the most marvelous evening, sir. I thought that, you know, Miss Lawrence was magic, and I thought you, of course, if I may say so, were wonderful. He said, well, what did you think of the young man? And I said, well, I thought he was frightfully good-looking. And in my very humble opinion, sir, I think he's a very good actor. He said, well, you're right, he said. He is a very good actor. In fact, he said, you've been watching tonight an actor who in a very short time will be acclaimed as the greatest actor in the world.
And then we went to New York with it. And then it was in New York, while we were playing there, that my first wife, Jill, was in the play. Then she and I signed up with Hollywood. terribly demanding approaches from all the studios, but the one we chose was RKO, because that was the youngest studio, and it was better for youngish people to belong to a younger studio.
Ladies and gentlemen, may a comparatively young English actor offer his very humble congratulations to those who have initiated this enterprise. Hollywood has set a very high standard of production, but I know perfectly well that the British brains and the British capital embodied in these and the other British studios will make the British picture Hollywood's most successful rival.
Oh, no. Get away from me. Don't you try a trick on me. A trick that you learned in other men's arms. Once I loved you. And now just remembering it makes me feel unclean. It'll be the rest of my life getting the taste out of my mouth.
Oh, Nick, we'll always quarrel, won't we?
You went quarreling, dear?
No, but whatever it was, I mean, we won't do any more tonight, will we?
No, dear, no. Not tonight.
Oh, no. Oh, no, not tonight.
Although Larry is a tiny bit older than I remember that I always used to treat him as if he were younger. He was, he wasn't exactly gauche. He wasn't gauche at all. He was very bright, very alert, but he was very simple and sweet and nice, and was a perfect target for practical jokes. And he took them all so well. He never got angry about them. He'd laugh at them himself. And so that would stimulate the rest of us to play jokes on him.
This is the most wonderful dance I've ever had.
You needn't say things like that now.
Why, what do you mean?
Well, the waiters aren't here to listen to us. You needn't bother to act.
I wasn't acting. I was sincere. Don't you think it's wonderful?
Larry at that time was married to Jill Esmond, of course, and the marriage was not entirely satisfactory because she was actually doing better than he. He was often referred to by the producers out there as that a good-looking but rather stiff young Englishman with a French name who looked like a young Ronald Colman. And that was rather putting offish for him, and things were not going too smoothly.
Tea or coffee?
Tea, please. Reminds me of England. Thank you.
I'm afraid I'm not a very good conversationalist in the morning.
Oh, that's funny. That reminds me of England, too.
Well, drink your tea up. It'll get cold.
Oh, well, if it does, it may be due to a certain chilliness in the atmosphere, don't you think?
Things look different in the cold morning light.
Oh, do I look so very different, then?
Most entirely. I see you as you really are now.
Why, what do you mean?
Well, do you think your present occupation is a particularly creditable one?
No, not particularly. But you knew all about that last night.
But what on earth made you accept such a job?
Well, he wasn't very much in love with films to begin with, but he was very conscientious about his work, frustrated by the lack of anything interesting to do in California, despising the conditions and the circumstances of his life there, and was anxious to get back to the UK and get back on the stage. So it was just killing time until he could do so.
Well, I did 3 pictures in 2 years. And the first of which was an extraordinary thing, I would hate to see it now. It was called Friends and Lovers, with Adolphe Menjou, Adolphe, as he was called, Lily Damita, Erich von Stroheim, and myself. And then I played 2 other films there in 2 years. That's all I did, and came back home, rather in disgust.
I met him when we started rehearsing a piece called Mary, Queen of Scots, by a playwright called Gordon Davitt, who'd made a big hit in London with Richard of Bordeaux, which was one of the success peaks of John Gielgud. And everybody was very confident about this, and John himself was directing the play. But in point of fact, it turned out to be disappointing. Gwen Franson Davis played Mary, and Glenn Byam Shaw played... I've forgotten his name, never mind. But Larry played Bothwell, Lord Bothwell, and he had the 3rd act of the piece, as it were. And he was a great hero to me, of course, because he was very commanding. He had great authority and was romantic in a tremendously masculine way. He was glamorous. He'd already been to Hollywood. And I don't know how big a success he made with the public, either in America or in England, among moviegoers, but to people like myself who studied every move of all other actors, I suppose, he was definitely a big man and very glamorous, a hero. He was great fun backstage. He was very good company. Peggy Webster, Margaret Webster, and another lady played ladies in waiting. And since there were long gaps for each of us between appearances, there was lots of opportunity on matinee days for them to prepare a very good tea. And so we would gather in these ladies' room and have tea and exchange stories and jokes. And Larry, of course, was the life and soul of the party.
It was the most wonderful first night of first nights, as you can imagine, for me. And it was also a turning point for Larry, because this was the first play. He wanted to have the fun of directing, but he also was an actor-manager and presenting the production. And this was, for him, the first step in what became the most illustrious career in the English-speaking theatre. But he did something awfully nice. He was mindful of me, and he took me by the hand and drew me forward, downstage and center, and asked the audience to welcome this young actress in whom there are undeniable and obvious potentialities. I'll always remember that night, and Larry opening the door and giving me that first wonderful opportunity. He was a perfectionist, and he seemed to know by instinct what would work, and was very much an actor's director. He didn't do it for us and tell us how to do it, but he elicited good performances, and he encouraged actors to try little things, you know, make little adventures and something different, keeping it fresh. He was immensely well liked by everybody, and he was fun. He was enormous fun. Gales of laughter between the spells of work. You know?
In 1935, I rather hastily got together a production of Romeo and Juliet, which I wanted to do very much. And I asked Robert Donat to play Romeo. He said he was engaged on preparing a production of his own, which rather put me out. However, then I asked Olivier, and he was planning another production of his with his first wife, Jill Esmond, which he gave up in order to appear with me. And we alternated the parts of Romeo and Mercutio, and I directed the play. He put on a straight false nose like a Bronzino portrait and looked simply splendid. It's one of his first false noses, which he was very fond of afterwards.
Olivier always struck me as the most exciting actor I've ever known. When he played Romeo in 1935, he almost sprang on the stage as a young gallant from the Renaissance. It just happened, and I still can remember the gasp in the theatre when that happened.
It was an enormous success with the help of Peggy Ashcroft and Edith Evans, who played the other two leading parts. And of course, he was very excited about it. And I was very nervous because I thought he didn't speak verse very well. And I thought I would better him in that way because I'd had more experience. I'd been at the Vic and so on. But although he got mixed notices, he was wonderful as Mercutio because he was so strong and virile and amusing and exciting, and he did a wonderful fight. And as Romeo, he was marvelously lovelorn. And whether he spoke the verse beautifully or not, he managed to convey the passions of Romeo far, far better than I did.
John spoke beautifully. I mean, nobody spoke Shakespeare more lyrically, more beautifully than John Gilbert. But you had the impression with John that in the balcony scene, for instance, that reaching up, you know, that if he'd got her, he wouldn't have known quite what to do with her. Whereas when Larry played it, you know that if he'd got her, he would have pulled her down or pulled himself up, and then I mean, it was the most sexual. Probably he didn't speak the lines so beautifully, but to me it was the most exciting Romeo I've ever seen. And then his Mercutio, the John Gielgud Mercutio, was this intellectual student, clever, witty, sweet, wonderful. And Larry was this wicked, bawdy, sexy. Oh, we were all, you know, I think in love with Larry Olivier.
You love me, don't you? Well, then. Settled?
I can't.
Michael.
I can't.
We have a right to be happy. Everyone's a right to be happy, Michael.
Everyone, yes. That is why we can't be.
The effect Vivian had on Larry must have been the effect she had on most people who met her and were excited by this extraordinary, splendid and vivacious person. But also, he was madly in love with her. And of course, this, I imagine, makes your circulation go a pace faster than in other people. And it was a great excitement to have these two people in love. The beginning of their life together was incredible. It must have caused an immense extra charge of work and activity in him, because he was so excited by life itself.
I remember in the early June of 1937, I was at Elsinore for the Old Vic Hamlet, which was to be transferred to the courtyard of the Kronborg Castle. But it rained so heavily that it seemed about 4 o'clock that afternoon that it would be quite impossible to do the play.
It bucketed down, absolutely poured. It was impossible. And Tony Guthrie, who was an extremely resourceful man, said, right, rise above it, come along, we'll do it somehow. We can't have all these people turn up and then cancel. It's too awful. We'll do it in the ballroom. We'll extemporize it in the ballroom. And he asked Larry and said, were you game for it? Larry said yes, and we did it.
His Hamlet that night was an extraordinary example of technique responding to a sudden emergency. Here Hamlet was in the center of his audience, passing in and out among them, acting on the smallest of cabaret stages, proving that there was no need to play behind a picture frame. Here he'd come out of the proscenium and he was involving us all in it.
I think that it was quite a feat to turn a performance which is set for a whole given lot of moves and positions and rhythms and completely extemporize it in another way. But this he did, just like that. And it's very typical, I think, of his, it's a very good example of his skill, and absolutely consummate skill, that he could do that and that he had a mind that was adaptable enough to do it.
It seemed to us to be something so new, so astonishing and so exciting, and the whole of the company followed his lead. And one remembers that as one of the performances of a lifetime.
Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. But if you mouth it, as many of your players do, I had as lief the town crier spoke my lines. No, do not saw the air too much with your hand thus, but use all gently. For in the very torrent, tempest, and as I may say, whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Oh, it offends me to the soul to hear a robustious, periwig-pated fellow tear a passion to tatters, to split the ears of the groundlings, who for the most part are capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and noise. I would have such a fellow whipped. Without Herod's Herod, pray you avoid it.
Heathcliff, when you went away, what did you do? Where did you go?
I went to Liverpool. One night I shipped for America on a brigantine going to New Orleans. We were held up by the tide, and I lay all night long on the deck, thinking of you, and the years and years ahead without you. I jumped overboard and swam ashore.
I think I'd have died if you hadn't.
Kathy, you're not thinking of that other world now.
Smell the heather. Heathcliff, fill my arms with heather. All they can hold. Come on.
Kathy, you're still my queen.
Ever since Wuthering Heights, had been madly in love with him, which I think many women were. 99%, I would say. Tremendous crush and admiration, of course. Still have it today.
Oh, I was carried away by her. Enchanted by her, as everyone was. And when I was married, I was told I was the luckiest man in the world. She was so lovely, so accomplished, so amusing. She's got the three things that really matter in a wife, everyone said. Breeding, brains, and beauty. And I believed them completely. But I never had a moment's happiness with her. She was incapable of love, or tenderness, or decency.
My first memories are every schoolgirl, I think, of my generation, and that is the Byronic beauty of Wuthering Heights, Rebecca. That saturnine, dark, beautiful face that I think every, I repeat, girl of my age fell in love with. I mean, that he was a true sex symbol, more than Clark Gable or Tyrone Power, or the ones who were supposed to be. He was the real thing.
Oh, Larry! Have you been waiting long?
33 years, 5 months. I can't remember the days, hours, and minutes, darling.
Oh, I love you when you are silly.
That means for life, but do you love me when I'm broke?
Oh, poor Larry. Nothing left out of your allowance.
4 whole pennies, all in paper. Poor old Keith, in the running for the bench and settled with a brother who backs nothing but losers.
Oh, darling, you do have rotten luck. You never win.
I knew though.
It was catnip. You know, they were the columnists' delight, and they were darlings of the British set in Hollywood, but they were welcomed everywhere. She was fresh from her great success, you know, as Scarlett O'Hara, and he had had his wonderful success as Heathcliff. They were a very delectable and extremely personable pair, and they were going to do wondrous things together on the screen and in the theatre, and it was a very wonderful time for them, I should say. It was the beginning of everything.
Great Britain went to war against Germany today. 25 years and 30 days from the time she entered the War of 1914 against the same enemy. France is expected to follow suit within the next few hours.
We were all together on the day that war was declared, and we were on a boat off Catalina Island in California, and David Niven was with us, and Bob Coote, who was a great friend, my wife, and Vivian and her mother was along. My mother came along as a chaperone. And we were listening to the radio, and everyone got very depressed. Larry had a few drinks under his belt and went out in a rowboat and visited all the yachts in the harbor and insulted everybody, saying, "This is the end, you're finished, you're done, just enjoy yourselves today, this is all over," and then say terribly insulting things to these people and row away. Whereupon complaints went to the Commodore of the yacht club that Ronald Colman was drunk and insulting, and they went to him and told him he had to apologize, and Colman hadn't been there at all. That was all Larry.
If you must thank me, let it be for yourself alone. Whatever I did, I thought only of you.
Oh, Mr. Darcy, when I think of how I've misjudged you, the horrible things I said, I'm so ashamed.
Oh, no, it's I who should be ashamed of my arrogance, of my stupid pride, of all except one thing. One thing. I'm not ashamed of having loved you. Elizabeth, dare I ask you again? Elizabeth, dear, beautiful Lizzie.
Larry was quite preoccupied during most of the shooting on Pride and Prejudice because he was planning his own production of Romeo and Juliet with himself and Vivian Lee to open in San Francisco and go on then to Broadway.
Everybody said, well, how much do you want and how much money do you need? And we put the play on in New York and it will be absolutely sensational. I mean, there's no way it can miss. So the play went on and it was received very well on the first night, but the critics decided that they didn't like it and they were not very good notices. And Larry said to me, he always has the most marvelous sense of humor about failure, I think. And he said, I was walking past the box office the next morning, strolling along, see how things were going, and I found a crowd of screaming people yelling for their money back for the night's performance. And he said, something said to me, I don't really think we've made it. So after this staggering and totally unpredictable flop in Romeo and Juliet, they took off back to Hollywood, where they were persuaded by Alexander Korda to make a picture called Lady Hamilton, which turned out to be the most enormous success. In fact, Winston Churchill, I think, saw it about 8 or 10 times.
Shouldn't have come. People will see you, they'll talk.
Oh, let them talk. I don't care, do you? Are you sorry?
I'm only sorry for all the wasted years I've been without you. For all the years I shall have to be without you.
You'll come back, won't you?
I wonder if I shall. I feel that I should not. You are married and I am married. In the magic and music of the ballroom, these things become rather blurred. They stand out very clearly in the dawn. Your life is here. My life is there.
Larry said nothing about when he was going back. We knew that he was always frightened to death of flying, hated flying, but he did when he had to, but he hated the idea, but he said nothing about it. We knew he had some commitments to finish films that he was contracted to do. But what no one knew, except 1 or 2 people, including myself, was that every morning he would get up about 4 or 5 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock he would show up at an airfield and take lessons in flying, which must have terrified him. Well, I know they did, because he just hated the whole idea, but he was determined. And then very quietly, without any beating of drums or blowing of bugles, he came back to the UK, and he presented himself to the Royal Navy, which he really preferred, and got a commission as a pilot in the Fleet Air Arm.
I think this was really because his very, very dear friend, Ralph Richardson, was already in it. And they spent some time in the Fleet Air Arm together. And they pranged so many planes that I'm sure the government decided that something had to be done to save the rest of the Air Force. And so they were, from time to time, asked to get out and do some propaganda work.
Eventually, the government insisted that they get him out of the Navy and do some films of the most outstanding, which was Henry V.
Henry must have been a turning point for everybody. I think he came out on the right day of the right week of the right month, the right year. The press show of Henry V was the 6th of June, and the Allies had just landed in Normandy. And I mean, it was this great paean of British military glory. You know, it was terribly moving that it should come out on that particular day. England was starving. It was exhausted from 4 years of war. The people of London and the big cities had been bombed night after night, you know. And this suddenly outpouring of Shakespearean great moment of England was Larry's contribution. I think it was a gorgeous moment of history.
Once more, unto the breach! Dear friends, once more, or close them all up with our English dead! In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. Then lend the eye a terrible aspect, let it pry through the portage of the head like the brass cannon. Let the brow o'erwhelm it as fearfully as doth a gauted rock, or hang on jutty his confounded base, swilled with a wild and wasteful ocean. Now set the teeth, and stretch the nostril wide. Hold hard the breath, and bend up every spirit to his full height. On, you noblest English, whose blood is fed from fathers of war-proof. Fathers that, like so many Alexanders, have in these parts from morn till even fought, and sheathed their swords for lack of argument. Dishonor not your mothers. Now attest that those whom you called fathers did beget you. Be copy now to men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not, for there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, training upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry! England and St. George!
It was Larry's conception all the way. I mean, it was his idea of how he wanted to do it. It was his idea to start the picture in the Globe Theatre and come outside. The actual aspect of the picture was really, I think, much more Roger Furze, who was only the dress designer, but I think he had a terrific lot to do with the conception of the sets. But dramatically, it was Larry, and it was his picture.
William adored working for Larry. I think he would never willfully work again for anybody else after he'd worked with Larry. Larry knew exactly what he wanted, and he would say, this is sort of the sort of music I like is, and he would say very patriotic or love-making or very soothing, and it gave William an idea of sorts. And then I suppose Larry was very surprised when the result came, but very delighted too, because he never expected it to fit into his ideal as well as it did. Wanted to make a piece of music that you could cut and start again and, you know, sort of lengthen bits and shorten bits, but it didn't work. He had to, at the end, write it for the film that Larry had taken. And he was just jolly lucky that it worked so beautifully.
Nice customs, courtesy to great kings. Dear Kate, you and I cannot be confined within the weak list of a country's fashion. We are the makers of manners, Kate. Therefore, patiently and yielding. You have witchcraft in your lips,
My generation had the immense good fortune to see the Old Vic Company when it was perhaps the greatest assembly of stars that has ever been gathered together in one group. The company at one time contained Olivier, Richardson, Alec Guinness, Sybil Thorndike, Lewis Casson, Peter Copley, George Relf, Pamela Brown, Margaret Leighton. There's never been a constellation like it. And not only was it my first view of these great stars, it was virtually my first visit to the theatre, because I was only a schoolboy at the time. And when the Old Vic was bombed, the Old Vic Theatre was bombed, the Old Vic Company moved to the new theatre in St Martin Lane, what is now the Albury.
And Tyrone Guthrie had been running it all this time. In fact, I think about 6 years before the war. He got the idea that if Ralph and I could be got out of the Navy, and if we joined him in the direction of the thing, that we might make a go of it. And John Burrow was asked to join us as well. And so permission was applied for our release from the Navy, which was granted with a lack of reluctance, which I'm afraid was almost hurting. However, Ralph and I got over that all right, and so we started the work with Old Vic again.
We rehearsed a great deal of the time under the table, because we were rehearsing in the National Gallery, which Kenneth Clark was so kind to lend us, because we had no theatre and had a big glass roof on top, and so with the bugs coming round all the time, the doodle bugs coming, we spent a lot of our speeches under the table, as I say.
One of the things that was clearly so marvellous and memorable about those seasons is that it contrasted so strikingly with the drabness of the war years, with rationing and with nothing being painted and with no excitement, except obviously the war itself. And these productions were full of light and colour. Quite consciously, I'm sure the directors knew that that's what they had to have. They had to give us the high style, the romantic parts and plays, the gorgeousness of verse speaking, everything to remind us that the war was nearly over and then was over when they went on past 1945.
We were lucky because the whole country had been under very short commons, not only for food and clothes and everything else, but for music and books and literature. And so we had a fine, strong company, that's true enough, but it was very different from the old days, the days when we worked greatly by experiment.
It was an amazing company in another sense, in that people didn't simply, the stars of the company didn't simply take the largest parts. Olivier, for instance, played the button moulder when Ralph Richardson played Peer Gynt, and Sybil Thorndike was Peer's mother.
Only that short part of the button moulder, which he made really quite an extraordinary sensation and an impression of something from another world, and yet he was perfectly ordinary.
He played Oedipus, and it was a wonderful production of the doom of a primitive king. And at the end of it, the blinded Oedipus, with the blood running from his eye holes, gives out this incredible scream, terrible ululation of pain and agony, which was both thrilling and devastating and entirely primitive, which has haunted me down the years. And I asked him, however, he came by this unearthly and terrible scream. And he said, first of all, he thought of foxes caught in traps. And he put his little hands out, and he thought of these paws of the foxes caught in traps. And then he thought of something even more terrible, and I don't know where he got the story, but he thought of the way they trap ermine in Arctic regions, and they put down salt on the ice, and the little ermine come and lick the salt off the ice, and their tongues freeze to the ice, so they can't get away, and their tongues are torn out, and they're killed in that way. And so what he was doing, standing on the stage, was suddenly becoming an ermine with its tongue stuck to the ice of an Arctic region, which is an extraordinary insight, I think, into the way an actor of genius's mind may work.
Then the same evening that he had played the noble and magnificent Oedipus, in the second half of the evening, he played Mr. Puff in The Critic. And I remember him coming down on a cloud from the flies, this extraordinary creature, high wig, and this 18th century delicacy that he had. I was lucky. I saw these wonderful seasons with Richardson and Olivier, and they're great. Really, the Old Vic Company was at its greatest.
We had some wonderful performances in Henry IV. We had Lawrence's first very great performance of his life, I think.
Hotspur.
I don't think it was ever, there were about 5 great performances that he gave, and I think the first he gave was his Hotspur.
Irish indeed.
A combination of romance and glory and power
There was a part, again, that might have been written for him. It had all the fire and dash and courage and handsomeness with which Olivier rightly has been associated throughout his career. And he played it for all it was worth. A huge, brilliant, romantic performance of a doomed hero, because after all, Hotspur is a rebel and in the end gets killed. You know, Olivier's always taken risks on the stage, but this one must have been a very great risk indeed, because the sword play was very, very realistic indeed. And he dies, as I recall, in that scene, when Harold Pretley chops his head off with a sword blow, and there's blood on his neck. He's gashed his neck. We get him to understand he's cut an artery, and he stood there before he toppled over with a crash to the floor. I'm sure plenty of people in the audience thought that it had actually happened, that Prince Hal had mistimed the blow and killed him. And then, of course, at the end of it all, when he's dead, he's lying there, and then there's the scene where Falstaff comes on and drags the body off, claiming to have killed him himself. When Richardson goes out, Falstaff dragging Hotspur behind him with his legs over his shoulders and Olivier's head bumping on the ground as he goes. And I tell you, Olivier playing dead is better than most actors playing live.
We always went to see him on his first night. That was automatic. And on this particular occasion, we knew he was playing Richard III. And the phone rang at about 6:30, and it was Larry. And he said, "I want you to come and see me before the show." I thought he'd gone mad, because, I mean, nobody ever wants anybody in a dressing room before the show. I mean, it's a holy place. You can't have anybody near you. You have to be alone and sweat it out. And I said, "You sure?" He said, "Yes, I want you to come and see me and bring Mary." So we dressed and rushed to the theatre, and there's the great man, made up as Richard with the hunchback, and it was an hour and a quarter before the curtain went up, with the wig and the hat and the whole thing. And he suddenly screamed and said, "Sit down, sit down." So I sat down. He said, "Now listen, you're a very, very close friend, and I want you to know the truth. Now tonight, you are going to see a total disaster. I am absolutely ghastly in the part. I never should have played it. I'm just miscast. We had 3 or 4 dry-ups through the dress rehearsal. I don't know what I'm doing, and I want you to know that I know that I'm absolutely dreadful." So I said, "Well," he said, that's all. Now you can go now, but I just wanted you to know. That's all. So we left the dressing room and tore across the road and had 3 double brandies. We were absolutely shaking, and went in front and sat there. I think we were in row 4. Curtain went up, and on came Mr. then, Olivier, and started The Winter of Discontent. And it was so frightening that I felt goose pimples up my back, and the audience froze. And he was in such a very weird, strange, frightening, intense mood that the whole theatre became bubbling. It was really weird. And he was just absolutely magical. And at the end, the curtain came down, and people just went absolutely raving mad. I've never been in the theatre and heard anything like it in my life. They knew that they were watching something very, very, very unusual and totally great. And this was an experience that I will never, ever, ever, ever forget.
Richard III has never been a favourite play of mine, although I've seen some fine performances. I remember Balliol Holloway, for instance, being very good in it. But the play does not appeal to me very much because I always feel there isn't any great suspense. He has such a very easy time getting all that he wants and getting rid of all his enemies and bumping them off one after the other, that there doesn't ever seem to me to be any much danger that he'll lose. But Olivier had this sense of danger which he sort of electrified, and you felt that he wasn't quite sure whether he would succeed. And when he did, he was so triumphant. And then he was haunted, of course, in the last scenes of the dreams and all that. Then we did it together on the screen, and I played Clarence. And that week or 2 weeks that we were together then, with Richardson and Cedric Hardwicke, both of whom were friends of his, I thought he was at the very top of his form. He was in a wonderful mood for his own acting because he knew the part so well. And he also managed everybody with consummate tact and sweetness, and the crew adored him, and all his friends were around him, Roger Furs and other people whom he was devoted to. And everybody was determined to make the very best of the film for his sake, particularly.
This scene out of the Battle of Bosworth was filmed on a bull ranch, which was to the north of Madrid. This particular shot, which we set up for him to do, was there was a tiny little winding stream, and the camera had been set up on a little hillock where they're just round the stream round the bottom of this little hillock. And the idea of the shot was that the camera would be pointing that way. Sir Lawrence would come on his charger, cross through a lot of men milling around fighting, and go through the stream, up the little hill. The camera would pan round with him. And just as he got about there, Sir George Brown, the archer, who was standing out of shot, would let go a warhead arrow, and it would go into the padding of the horse. The horse was trained to fall down, and the next shot, of course, would be a horse making for a horse. That was the idea. George was already quite relaxed with his 40-pound pull, which is pretty heavy, and a warhead arrow, because the padding of the horse starts with cork, then goes into wood, then steel. And what everybody wanted to see, of course, was this arrow going like that. And that's what it would do in a thing like that. So, here we go, all set up, deadly quiet in this total open space. And Sir Lawrence came charging through on his horse, over the stream, up the little hill, and George let go with an arrow, straight into Olivier's leg. And then he called Tony over, Tony Bouchot, and the conversation was, did you get that in the camp? Tony said yes. And he decided a series of shots, how to use the arrow sticking in his leg, how he would break it off, limp away, etc., to the next shot, which was a horse or horse making him for a horse. And when they discussed that, then he said, now get me off this horse and get me a doctor.
I think there be 6 Richmonds in the field. 5 have I slain today instead of him. The horse! The horse!